She had spent her life saving others, a seasoned nurse steady under pressure. But that September evening when she walked through her front door in Portland, Oregon, she had no idea she was stepping into a trap meant to end her life. He had paid $50,000 to make her disappear. A husband's betrayal hidden behind a hired gun, a stranger waiting in the dark with a hammer in hand. But what happened next would defy every plan, every expectation, because instead of becoming another tragic headline, she fought back and killed the hitman sent to kill her. What drives a man to order his own wife's murder? And how did she, alone and unarmed, turn the tables in one of the most shocking acts of survival ever recorded? If you love real stories of survival and justice, hit subscribe, because this one will leave you stunned. Before the horror that would change everything, there was just Susan. 51 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, an emergency room nurse with 20-plus years of experience, known for her steady hands and calm heart in the middle of chaos. To her co-workers at Providence Portland Medical Center, she was the kind of nurse you wanted beside you when lives hung in the balance, patient, unflinching, compassionate. And to her friends, Susan was the one who found light even in the darkest corners. The one who baked cookies for night shifts, who never missed a birthday, who somehow believed that kindness could heal even the hardest wounds. Outside the ER, her world was quieter. A modest home in Portland's Montevilla neighborhood, a small garden, family photos on the wall, the rhythm of a life built on routine. It was here she lived with her husband, Michael Kuhnhausen. They'd met in the late 1980s, two people drawn together by a shared need for stability. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at the same hospital where she cared for patients. In the beginning, they seemed ordinary: dinners at home, weekend drives, small vacations. A quiet marriage built on comfort more than passion. But as the years passed, that comfort began to crack. Michael grew distant, moody. His humor soured into bitterness, and the laughter that once filled their home was replaced by silence. Friends would later recall how Susan often tried to fix things, tried to reach him, but the harder she tried, the more he pulled away. His temper simmered beneath the surface, a slow burn masked by polite smiles in public. By 2006, 18 years into their marriage, the love that once held them together had eroded. Susan had filed for divorce that June, a step that finally separated her from the storm she'd quietly endured. The papers were signed, but the emotions weren't. Michael was angry, not just at losing her, but at what he saw as losing everything. The $300,000 home they shared, her life insurance policy, the stability she had built without him. To Susan, it was freedom. To Michael, it was humiliation. Friends say Susan was finally starting to rediscover herself. Fresh haircut, new routines, small steps toward happiness. But what she didn't know was that someone she once loved was already plotting her death. Behind the suburban smiles, behind the hospital corridors and quiet evenings, something sinister was forming. And soon, her fight to heal others would become a fight to survive herself. It was Wednesday, September 6, 2006. For Susan Kuhnhausen, it had been just another long day at Providence Portland Medical Center. 12 hours of tending to emergencies, calming frightened patients, and stitching wounds that told stories of chaos and chance. As her shift ended, she decided to do something simple. Something just for herself. She stopped by a nearby salon for a quick haircut and a touch of color, a small act of self-care after months of emotional exhaustion. Her divorce from Michael had left her drained, but free, and that evening as the Oregon sun dipped low over Portland, she felt a flicker of hope returning. At around 6:30 p.m., Susan drove home through familiar streets, tree-lined blocks she'd driven hundreds of times before. She pulled into her driveway on Southeast 32nd Avenue, the house standing quiet and ordinary just as she had left it. She parked, grabbed her things and walked toward the front door, her mind already shifting to dinner and a quiet night alone. But as soon as she stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was heavy. Too still. The curtains, normally open to let in the evening light, were drawn shut. The rooms were dark, unusually so. The kind of darkness that makes the hairs on your neck rise, even before your brain understands why. She called out softly, nothing. No answer. Just the faint creak of floorboards under her own feet. Years of emergency work had sharpened her instincts, and in that moment, something deep inside whispered that she wasn't alone. As she walked down the hallway toward her bedroom, she saw movement. A sudden shift in the shadows. Before she could react, he was on her. From the darkness, a man lunged, older, wiry, his eyes locked with a predator's focus. In his hand, a red and black claw hammer. He swung hard, the first blow landing across her temple, sending her sprawling. Pain exploded in her head, blood already running down her face. But this was no random attack. The man was 59-year-old Edward Dalton Haffey, a convicted felon, a known drug user, and an ex-con with a violent past. He hadn't broken in to steal. He was there for one reason: to kill her. And though she didn't know it yet, this wasn't a stranger's crime. This was a message, sent from someone she once trusted with her life. Susan Kuhnhausen, the nurse who had saved countless others, now faced the fight of her life, alone inside her own home. What unfolded next would shock even the most hardened detectives. The man attacking Susan wasn't a stranger in the night. His name was Edward Dalton Haffey, 59 years old, a convicted felon, and a man whose life had been defined by violence and addiction. He had a long criminal record, including assault, and he'd spent years drifting between jobs, jail cells, and the edges of Portland's underworld. Out on parole and desperate for cash, Haffey had agreed to do one final job: kill a woman he'd never met. The first blow from his hammer split the skin on Susan's head. But instead of falling, she fought back. Years in the emergency room had trained her to stay calm when chaos exploded, to think, to act, not to freeze. That training, and a fierce will to live, ignited in her veins. She lunged forward, closing the distance to take away his leverage. If she stayed close, he couldn't swing the hammer. Her fingers clawed for his arm, grappling for control, every heartbeat echoing in her ears. He was bigger, but she was relentless. He tried to hit again, but she ducked, blood running down her face, pain blurring her vision. She knew she had seconds, maybe less, to shift the power. He punched her, once, twice, the room spinning with each blow. But she didn't stop. She bit down on his arm, hard, tasting blood, knowing it would leave a mark, proof he'd been there. Then she bit his thigh, deep enough to make him scream. Haffey gasped in pain, trying to wrench free. "You're strong," he whispered through gritted teeth. That was the last thing he ever said. Susan wrapped her left arm around his neck, a chokehold she'd learned in a self-defense class years earlier. She locked it tight, her weight pressing against his chest, every muscle burning. He fought, clawed, kicked, but she held on tighter. Seconds felt like hours. His movements slowed. His face turned purple, then blue, and then he stopped. She didn't know if he was dead, only that she was still alive. Her body trembled. Blood ran from her scalp. Her hands, shaking, searched for the hammer, just in case. The house was silent now. The man who came to kill her lay motionless on the floor of her bedroom. She had just survived an execution, one planned by the man she once called her husband. And in that stillness, one truth settled in her mind. If she hadn't fought back, she would never have seen another sunrise. It was 7:45 p.m. when the call came in. A neighbor's voice, trembling, urgent. "We have an intruder in the house next door. The woman who lives there thinks she may have strangled him." He was down when she left. Susan Walters, bloodied, barefoot, her face swollen from blows, had escaped her own home and pounded on her neighbor in Warnock's door, gasping for help. When the first officers arrived, they found her shaking, her hair matted with blood, and her hands trembling. She told them, "He tried to kill me, he's still inside." Inside the house, police moved carefully. The air was thick, heavy, a mix of sweat, blood, and silence. And there, sprawled across the bedroom floor, was a man, Edward Dalton Haffey, unresponsive, a hammer lying inches from his hand. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives began combing through the home, documenting every trace of the violent struggle. The overturned lamp, the splattered walls, the hammer, a pair of work gloves. But what they found next changed everything. Inside Haffey's backpack was a day planner. And in that planner, a note, short, handwritten, and deeply unsettling. It read, "Call Mike." Detectives paused. Who was Mike? Why was his name in the belongings of a dead hitman? As they searched further, they found Haffey's phone and a list of numbers. One of them connected to Michael Kuhnhausen, Susan's estranged husband. While paramedics treated Susan for her wounds, 14 stitches to her scalp, deep bruises along her face and arms, investigators began connecting the dots. The hammer attack hadn't been random. It wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was planned. And the name Mike wasn't just coincidence. As Susan sat in the hospital, replaying the horror in her mind, police were already knocking on another door, the one belonging to her ex-husband. He had no idea yet that the man he paid to kill his wife had failed, and that the woman he tried to erase from this world was still alive. Inside the Portland Police Bureau's homicide unit, detectives began piecing together what had really happened on that September evening. Every clue, the hammer, the planner, the note, pointed to something larger. This wasn't a break-in. It was a contract killing. Detective Paul Dalby and his team started with the name written in the planner, "Call Mike." When they traced the contacts in Edward Haffey's phone, one number appeared repeatedly, belonging to Michael James Kuhnhausen, Susan's estranged husband. Michael wasn't a stranger to investigators. They learned he was a 60-year-old maintenance worker at Providence Medical Center, the same hospital where Susan had worked for years as a nurse. That's where they'd met in the late 1980s, co-workers who became lovers, then husband and wife. For almost 2 decades they shared a quiet suburban life. But behind that calm surface, friends said Michael had grown bitter. He struggled with depression and control issues. As their marriage began to crumble, Susan, tired of the anger, the emotional distance, the fear, filed for divorce in June 2006. Detectives soon learned that Haffey wasn't just some random criminal. He and Michael had worked together years earlier, through a mutual acquaintance who moved in Portland's seedy underworld. Phone records, witness statements, and transaction timelines started aligning. Then came the money trail. Investigators found evidence suggesting that Michael had withdrawn a large amount of cash shortly before the attack, up to $50,000, and passed it to Haffey to carry out the murder. The same man Susan had once promised to love and protect her had become the architect of her death. When detectives finally questioned Michael Kuhnhausen, the calm, mild-mannered maintenance worker unraveled. At first he denied everything, claiming no knowledge of Haffey, no involvement at all. But the evidence was overwhelming. Haffey's planner, the phone logs, the timing of the calls, the witnesses who saw Michael with him weeks before the attack. Eventually, he broke. Michael confessed. He admitted hiring Edward Haffey to kill his wife, offering $50,000 in cash, motivated by anger over the divorce and resentment toward the life Susan was building without him. He wanted control. He wanted her home, her insurance, her freedom, gone. His motive was as simple as it was monstrous: rage, control, and money. And as police documented his confession, one truth became clear. The monster Susan had fought off in her bedroom was only half the story. Months after the attack, the case of the state of Oregon versus Michael James Kuhnhausen reached the courtroom. For Susan, it was not just a legal proceeding, it was a confrontation with the man who had tried to end her life. The man she had once loved, once trusted. Detectives and prosecutors presented the evidence. The note in the planner, the financial withdrawals, and Michael's own confession. In the face of overwhelming proof, Michael Kuhnhausen made a choice. He pled guilty to solicitation of aggravated murder, admitting that he had paid Edward Haffey $50,000 to kill his estranged wife. According to Multnomah County court records, the plea was entered in 2008. The judge sentenced him to 30 years in prison, a term that reflected not only the crime itself but the chilling betrayal it represented. In court, Susan stood before the man who had orchestrated her murder. She spoke with a voice both steady and wounded, not to seek vengeance but to reclaim her truth. Her words were simple yet powerful. "I find some peace in the fact that my husband admitted in open court what he did." For years she had lived with the quiet burden of their failing marriage, the emotional distance, the fear, the slow erosion of trust. Now, standing in that courtroom, she faced not a husband but a convicted criminal. Michael Kuhnhausen's sentencing marked the end of the investigation, but not the end of Susan's pain. The attack had left her with physical scars, bruises, broken ribs, and the 14 stitches that lined her neck and face. Yet, those wounds would heal long before the emotional ones did. In the aftermath, Susan continued working as a nurse for a time, drawing strength from the same compassion that had defined her life before the attack. But the trauma lingered. The memory of that night, the betrayal, the quiet of an empty home that once held shared dreams. The justice system had done its part. Michael was behind bars, serving his decades-long sentence. But Susan's victory wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about survival. She had faced the darkest form of betrayal and lived to tell her story, a story that would come to symbolize resilience, courage, and the unyielding will to live. It wasn't victory. It was survival. But survival came with scars. In the months after the trial, Susan Kuhnhausen began to rebuild her life, one quiet day at a time. She had survived an attack that was meant to silence her forever. But survival, she would later say, was only the beginning. The woman once known as Susan Kuhnhausen made a powerful decision. She changed her name to Susan Walters, a symbolic step toward reclaiming her identity. No longer defined by the man who had tried to destroy her, she carried forward the name of her own choosing. But even as she worked to move on, the shadows of that September night followed her. According to public interviews, Susan struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, recurring nightmares and sudden panic attacks. Crowded spaces unsettled her. The sound of footsteps behind her would sometimes send her heart racing. Years of caring for others as an emergency nurse had taught her how to mend wounds, but emotional healing demanded something different. She began therapy, step by step confronting the trauma that had nearly consumed her. Over time, Susan turned pain into purpose. She began speaking publicly, not as a victim but as an advocate. She volunteered and mentored other women who had escaped domestic abuse or attempted murder, helping them navigate fear and reclaim their sense of safety. Her message was never sensational, it was deeply human. In a 2016 interview with Willamette Week, Susan shared what survival truly meant to her. Her voice was calm but firm as she said, "I survived because I fought, but I shouldn't have had to." Those words carried the weight of experience and the quiet defiance of someone who refused to be defined by violence. Through her advocacy, Susan worked with local organizations and supported legislative initiatives in Oregon aimed at strengthening protective laws and self-defense resources for women. Her case drew renewed attention to gaps in domestic violence prevention and highlighted how systems could fail victims before tragedy strikes. County programs later expanded to include improved safety planning and community-based intervention. Echoes of the awareness her story helped to raise. For Susan, healing was never about forgetting. It was about reclaiming power, not from the past but from within herself. She learned to laugh again, to find peace in quiet mornings, and to draw strength from helping others walk the same difficult road. Her story reached far beyond the headlines. It became more than a case, it became a message. A reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to keep living despite it. Susan Walter's journey did not end with survival. It began there. He wanted her gone forever. Instead, she became the voice for countless others. Evil had written a plan, every detail meant to end her story. But courage took the pen and rewrote the ending. Susan Walters survived an unthinkable betrayal. She lost the life she once knew, but gained something stronger. A voice that now speaks for every person who's ever been told to stay quiet, to endure, to forgive what should never be forgiven. Her journey, from an ordinary nurse in Portland to a national symbol of survival, reminds us how fragile and how fierce the human spirit can be. She didn't just fight for her life that night. She fought for the right to be heard, to heal, and to make sure others would never face the same terror alone. What would you have done in her place? Would you have found that strength, or been paralyzed by fear? And after all that, do you think justice was enough? Could more have been done, for her and for others like her? If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or see the world a little differently, hit like, subscribe and share it. Because every time a story like this is told, another person finds the courage to speak up, to reach out, to survive. This is not just true crime. It's true survival.